March 21st, 1918. 4:40 in the morning, the Western Front. Sergeant Jean-Baptiste Moreau pressed his face against the frozen earth of his forward trench, feeling the ground shake beneath him like a living thing. The sky above northern France had transformed into a hellscape of fire and fury. 6,500 German guns and 3,500 mortars had opened their mouths simultaneously, and the world was ending in thunder and flame. For 5 hours, over 1 million shells would rain down on a 50-mile stretch of British and French positions. This was Operation Michael, the opening blow of Germany's spring offensive, their final desperate gamble to win the war before American reinforcements could tip the balance irreversibly against them. Behind this catastrophic bombardment waited something new, something the Allies had never faced in such numbers. German stormtroopers, elite assault troops trained in revolutionary infiltration tactics, armed with grenades, flamethrowers, and the world's first submachine gun, the Bergmann MP-18. These weren't the massed formations of 1914. These were small, fast-moving squads of Germany's best soldiers, hand-picked men who had learned to flow like water through defensive positions, bypassing strong points and striking into the soft rear areas where headquarters, supply depots, and artillery positions waited undefended. They had been training for months while being withdrawn from the front lines. They ate the best food Germany could still provide. They wore the finest equipment. They represented Germany's last hope. But they didn't know what was waiting for them in those trenches. Sergeant Moreau commanded a French machine gun section equipped with 2 Hotchkiss Model 1914 machine guns. These were not the glamorous weapons of war. No one wrote poems about them. They lacked the thunder of artillery or the glory of the cavalry charge. They were industrial instruments of death, gas-operated, air-cooled, and utterly reliable. Each gun weighed 54 pounds and sat on a tripod, bringing the total weight to around 88 pounds. They were fed by 24-round metal strips that had to be constantly reloaded, a feature that seemed like a weakness compared to the belt-fed Maxim guns used by the Germans. But what the Hotchkiss lacked in capacity, it made up for in something far more important: dependability. The Hotchkiss Model 1914 was the world's first truly efficient air-cooled machine gun. While the German Maxim required water cooling and could fail if that water boiled away or froze, the Hotchkiss used a simple but brilliant solution. 5 large brass rings looking like donuts encircled the barrel near the breech where heat was most intense. These rings provided 10 times the surface area for heat dissipation while adding minimal weight. The gun could fire continuously for extended periods, needing only occasional barrel changes that could be performed in seconds with a special wrench. Even more importantly, the Hotchkiss was simple. It contained only 32 parts, including 4 coil springs and no screws or pins whatsoever. Every part was designed so it could only be assembled in the correct way. You literally could not put a Hotchkiss together incorrectly. This simplicity meant reliability under the worst conditions imaginable. Mud, snow, rain, dust. The weapon kept firing. By late 1917, after 3 years of watching the supposedly superior Saint Etienne Model 1907 machine gun fail repeatedly in combat, the French army had made the Hotchkiss their infantry standard. By the end of 1918, 47,000 Hotchkiss machine guns had been delivered to French forces alone. The American Expeditionary Force, arriving in France without adequate machine guns, purchased 7,000 Hotchkiss guns and used them extensively throughout 1917 and 1918. The weapon had proven itself in the most brutal testing ground imaginable, the Western Front. When German artillery observers spotted these guns in defensive positions, they called them by a specific term: Hindernisse, obstacles, things that had to be destroyed before infantry could advance. They were right to fear them. The genesis of the stormtrooper threat that Sergeant Moreau and his men would face had begun in March 1915, when German High Command formed the first Sturmabteilung, an assault detachment. The traditional tactics of massed infantry attacks had proven suicidal against machine gun fire. Something new was needed. Captain Willy Rohr, later promoted to major, took command of the experimental unit and revolutionized German assault doctrine. He initially experimented with body armor and heavy shields, but quickly realized that speed offered better protection than steel. The only armor that remained was the new Stahlhelm, the distinctive coal scuttle helmet that would define the German soldier for the next 3 decades. Raw's tactics were built around small squad-sized units, supported by heavy weapons and artillery, coordinated at the lowest possible level. These squads would attack with hand grenades, rolling up enemy trenches rather than attempting to overrun them frontally. The tactics were first tested in October 1915 in a successful assault on a French position in the Vosges Mountains. The results were impressive enough that German High Command began forming specialised stormtrooper battalions across the Western Front. By 1916, the concept had matured. General Oskar von Hutier, commanding the 8th Army, became the champion of these new methods. What came to be known as Hutier tactics in Allied parlance combined several revolutionary elements. First, a short but devastatingly intense artillery bombardment using mixed high explosive and poison gas shells. The brevity was crucial for surprise. Long bombardments gave defenders time to bring up reserves. Second, the artillery would create a rolling barrage, a curtain of fire moving slowly forward with the infantry, following immediately behind. Third, the stormtroopers would advance in small dispersed groups rather than massed formations, making them harder to target. Fourth, and most importantly, they would attack weakness, not strength. When they encountered heavy resistance, they wouldn't stop to fight. They would bypass the strong point and continue into the rear, leaving follow-on waves of irregular infantry to reduce the isolated positions. This was warfare reimagined. Instead of trying to destroy the enemy line through frontal assault, the stormtroopers would infiltrate through it, creating chaos in the rear areas. Command posts would be overrun, artillery batteries would be attacked from behind, supply dumps would be captured, communications would be severed, and the frontline defenders, isolated and surrounded, would have to surrender or die. The weapons these elite troops carried reflected their mission. Each stormtrooper squad included men with specialized equipment. Some carried lightweight Bergmann MP-18 submachine guns, the first of their kind to see widespread use. These weapons fired pistol ammunition, but at a rate of fire approaching 500 rounds per minute. In the close confines of trench fighting, they were devastating. Other squad members carried bags of stick grenades, the distinctive steel hand granite that Allied troops nicknamed potato mashers. Still others hauled flamethrowers, terrible weapons that could clear a trench or bunker in seconds with jets of burning fuel. Light machine guns like the MG08/15, an air-cooled variant of the heavy Maxim, provided suppressive fire. Light mortars could be brought forward quickly to provide immediate fire support. The stormtroopers even carried their own medical supplies, ammunition and food, allowing them to operate independently far from support. These men trained relentlessly. While regular German infantry suffered in the trenches, stormtrooper units were withdrawn for weeks of intensive preparation. They practiced assault techniques on mock-ups of enemy positions built to exact specifications from aerial reconnaissance photographs. They rehearsed coordination between infantry and artillery until it was seamless. They learned to read terrain and exploit any cover available. They were given the best rations Germany could still provide in 1918, when the British naval blockade was causing severe food shortages throughout the Reich. Most importantly, they were encouraged to think. Traditional German military doctrine was quite flexible despite its reputation for rigid Prussian discipline. Officers at all levels were given objectives rather than detailed instructions and expected to use their initiative in achieving those objectives. This concept, which would later be formalised as Auftragstaktik or mission-type tactics, reached its fullest expression with the stormtroopers. Squad leaders made independent decisions. If an opportunity presented itself, they seized it without waiting for orders. If their assigned route was too heavily defended, they found another. This decentralised command structure required intelligent, motivated soldiers, and that's exactly what the stormtrooper units contained. Many came from Jaeger battalions, elite light infantry with traditions of marksmanship and independent action. Others came from pioneer units and brought expertise in explosives and engineering. The best men from regular infantry units were recruited. These were not merely Germany's finest soldiers, they were Germany's last chance. By early 1918, after Russia's collapse freed 50 German divisions from the Eastern Front, Germany enjoyed temporary numerical superiority on the Western Front for the first time since 1914. They had 192 divisions totaling 3.5 million men facing 172 Allied divisions. But this advantage was fleeting. American divisions were arriving in France at an accelerating pace. Each month of delay meant more fresh American troops in the line. General Erich Ludendorff, effectively Germany's military dictator, knew he had to strike now or lose the war. The strategy for the spring offensive was simple in concept but enormously ambitious in execution. Operation Michael would smash through British lines near the Somme River, driving northwest to separate the British from the French and capture the vital communication centre at Amiens. Once the British were isolated, they could be destroyed piecemeal. France, standing alone, would have to negotiate peace. 3 subsequent operations, Georgette, Gneisenau, and Blücher York, would follow up to exploit success and keep the Allies off balance. For Operation Michael, Ludendorff assembled 69 German divisions to face 32 British divisions. In some sectors, the Germans achieved local superiority of 4-1 or even greater. The artillery concentration was unlike anything yet seen in the war. 1 gun for every 12 yards of front. Previous offensives had averaged 1 gun per 60 yards. The Germans massed nearly 10,000 artillery pieces and mortars. When that hurricane bombardment lifted on March 21, 1918, the Stormtroopers went forward into the fog and smoke. In many sectors they achieved stunning success. The British Fifth Army, holding positions they had only recently taken over from French units, found their incomplete defences penetrated in multiple places. The German advance in some areas reached 40 miles in just a few days, the deepest penetration by either side since the War of Movement ended in 1914. British and French troops fell back in fighting retreats, suffering heavy casualties. Within 3 days, the Germans opened a 50-mile wide gap in the Allied line. Nearly 1,000 artillery pieces were captured. Over 90,000 prisoners were taken. For a brief moment it seemed that Germany might actually win the war. But something was going wrong. The stormtrooper tactics that had proven so effective in breaking through, the front line were producing diminishing returns as the advance continued. The problem was fundamental. The best German soldiers, the men with the training and equipment and elan to conduct these sophisticated infiltration attacks, were leading every assault. They were suffering disproportionate casualties, and unlike rifles or artillery shells, elite soldiers could not be manufactured in factories. The follow-on waves of regular infantry, less well trained and equipped, tried to maintain the momentum but found themselves making traditional massed attacks against defenders who were no longer surprised or disorganized. Casualties among these conventional formations were severe. Moreover, the fast-moving advance created its own problems. Supply lines stretched thin. The devastated battlefields of the Somme, where the Germans were advancing, had been deliberately destroyed by British scorched earth tactics before their withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line in 1917. There were few intact roads, no functioning railways, and the Germans were moving through territory they themselves had pulverized with artillery in previous years. The stormtroopers could carry only so much ammunition and food. Resupply took longer and longer, and all the while they were moving further from the protection of their own artillery. German field guns had to be moved forward through this devastated landscape, a process that took days. Meanwhile, Allied artillery, falling back on intact infrastructure, could shift positions rapidly. The defenders' advantage was reasserting itself. Most critically, the Germans were running into an obstacle they had not fully anticipated. French and British machine gun positions, many equipped with Hotchkiss guns, began to exact a terrible toll. The most famous example of Hotchkiss reliability under extreme conditions had occurred 2 years earlier, in the spring of 1916 during the Battle of Verdun. A French machine gun section armed with 2 Hotchkiss guns found itself cut off behind German lines near Hill 304. For 10 consecutive days and nights, completely isolated from supplies and communication, these 2 guns held their position against repeated German assaults. They fired over 150,000 rounds of ammunition. Think about that for a moment. 75,000 rounds per gun. The normal ammunition supply for a machine gun section was 5,000 rounds. This section fired 30 times their normal load. How? The men, desperate and determined, broke into a nearby dump of infantry rifle ammunition. They hand-loaded the metal ammunition strips for the Hotchkiss guns, round by round, under fire. 24 rounds per strip. They loaded over 6,000 strips. Hour after hour, day after day, night after night, they fed ammunition into those guns and fired at attacking Germans. The guns did not fail. The barrels had to be changed periodically as they heated to over 400 degrees Celsius, glowing dark red in the darkness, but the simple, robust mechanism of the Hotchkiss kept cycling. Gas tapped from the barrel drove a piston that operated the action. The 5 brass cooling rings dissipated heat. The 32 parts functioned flawlessly despite mud, rain, and continuous operation. When German forces finally overran the position after 10 days, they found the gun still operational, the crew dead or captured, and thousands of empty brass cartridge cases piled around the position like snowdrifts. German after-action reports noted the incident with a mixture of respect and horror. 2 machine guns had held off battalion-strength attacks for 10 days. The implications were sobering. If properly positioned and supplied with ammunition, machine guns could deny terrain to attackers regardless of their courage or tactical sophistication. And by 1918, the French army understood this lesson completely. Machine gun sections were integrated into defensive positions at every level. Battalion strongpoints, company redoubts, platoon positions all had machine guns sighted to provide interlocking fields of fire. The Hotchkiss, with its rate of fire of approximately 450 rounds per minute, could in theory fire 7,200 rounds in 16 minutes of continuous operation. In practice, fire discipline meant burst firing. 8 to 10 round bursts were standard, giving an effective sustained rate of about 120 aimed shots per minute. This could continue almost indefinitely with regular barrel changes every 1,000 rounds or so. The 8mm reliable ammunition fired by French Hotchkiss guns was itself formidable. The standard cartridge fired a 198-grain bullet at around 2,350 feet per second, delivering substantial energy at combat ranges. At 600 meters or less, machine gun fire created what the French called feu fauchant, mowing fire. The gun could be traversed side to side while firing, creating a fan of bullets that swept an area clean of attackers. At longer ranges, the bullets fell in an elliptical beaten zone, allowing area fire against targets that couldn't be seen directly. Proper machine gun employment required training and technique. The guns were mounted on adjustable tripods that allowed precise aiming. Fire was controlled by officers or senior non-commissioned officers who understood ballistics and could exploit the terrain. Defensive positions were carefully planned. Machine guns were sighted to cover likely avenues of approach with overlapping fields of fire. If one gun was knocked out, others could cover its sector. Alternate positions allowed crews to displace if their primary position was located and targeted by enemy artillery. The ammunition supply system was equally important. Each Hotchkiss gun in a defensive position would have thousands of rounds stockpiled nearby, already loaded into the metal strips for rapid feeding. Ammunition bearers stood ready to bring forward more supplies as needed. The guns themselves were often protected by steel shields or placed in reinforced positions that provided protection from small arms fire and shell fragments while allowing the gun to fire through an aperture. This was the defensive system that German stormtroopers encountered when they finally reached French positions during the spring offensive, and they discovered that their infiltration tactics, which had worked so well against the less prepared British Fifth Army, faced a different challenge against French machine gun defences. The problem was fundamental. Infiltration tactics depended on mobility and surprise. Stormtroopers bypassed strongpoints and flowed through gaps in the defensive line. But French defensive doctrine, refined through 4 years of bitter experience, didn't create linear defences that could be penetrated. Instead, they established defence in depth with mutually supporting strongpoints. Each position could see and fire into the areas around neighbouring positions. When German stormtroopers tried to bypass a French machine gun nest, they found themselves moving into the beaten zone of another gun. When they tried to suppress one position with their own firepower, other machine guns would engage them from the flanks. The decentralized nature of their tactics, which was a strength in the assault, became a vulnerability. Small groups of stormtroopers, advancing independently, found themselves taking fire from multiple directions from an enemy they couldn't locate or suppress. The Hotchkiss guns, positioned in hardened emplacements, were nearly impossible to knock out without direct artillery support, and the German artillery, racing to keep up with the advancing infantry, was often too far back to help. Moreover, the French had learned to integrate their machine guns with their artillery in a deadly combination. As German troops advanced into machine gun fire and were forced to take cover, French artillery observers would call down fire on the pinned attackers. The combination of machine guns fixing the enemy in place and artillery destroying them had proven devastatingly effective. The German stormtroopers also faced a psychological challenge they hadn't fully anticipated. These elite soldiers were accustomed to success. They had trained to punch through enemy lines, create chaos, and achieve objectives quickly. But French machine gun defences forced them into exactly the kind of grinding, attritional fight their tactics were designed to avoid. Instead of flowing around strongpoints, they found themselves having to reduce them one by one. Instead of quick advances, they faced slow, costly progress measured in meters rather than kilometers, and with every meter they lost more irreplaceable men. The casualty figures tell the story. In the first day of Operation Michael, the Germans suffered 40,000 casualties. Many of these were stormtroopers, the men they could least afford to lose. As the offensive continued through late March and into April, German losses mounted. By the time Operation Michael sputtered to a halt, in early April, having gained significant ground but failed to achieve its strategic objectives, Germany had lost over 230,000 men. The subsequent operations, Georgette in April, Gneisenau, which was never actually launched, and Blücher York in late May, followed the same pattern. Initial success as stormtroopers broke through the Allied lines, followed by slowdown as the advance outran its supplies and encountered prepared defensive positions anchored by machine guns. The Third Battle of the Aisne, part of Blücher York, saw German forces actually reach the Marne River, the closest they had been to Paris since 1914. French positions along the Aisne were penetrated, and for several days it appeared another crisis loomed. But French machine gunners, including many equipped with Hotchkiss guns, formed improvised defensive lines that slowed the German advance. One famous photograph from this period, later used in French war bond posters, shows an American soldier manning a smoking Hotchkiss gun with empty ammunition boxes at his feet, desperately calling for more ammunition. The American Expeditionary Force had entered the fighting by this point, and many American machine gun companies were equipped with the French weapons. The caption on the poster read, "Send them bullets." The image captured the reality of machine gun warfare. The weapon itself was reliable. The ammunition was the limiting factor. Feed a Hotchkiss enough bullets, and it would keep firing. Starve it of ammunition, and the position would fall. The Germans learned this the hard way. Time and again, their attacks would succeed in isolating French machine gun positions, cutting them off from resupply. But those isolated guns would continue firing, sometimes for days, until they literally ran out of ammunition. Only then could the position be taken, and by that time, the delay had allowed French reserves to move up and establish new defensive lines further back. The most remarkable aspect of these actions was how few men it took to hold critical positions. A Hotchkiss machine gun section consisted of typically 3 men: a gunner, an assistant gunner who fed ammunition, and a section leader who controlled fire. 3 men with 1 machine gun could deny an avenue of approach to an entire company of attackers. The firepower multiplication was extraordinary. Contemporary estimates varied, but a common assessment was that a single well-positioned machine gun was worth the firepower of 60 to 80 riflemen. And unlike riflemen, the machine gun never got tired, never lost its nerve, and could maintain fire indefinitely as long as it had ammunition, and the barrel was changed periodically. The psychological impact of machine gun fire was also significant. German soldiers who survived the spring offensive later described the terror of attacking into machine gun fire. The sound was distinctive, a rapid hammering that could be heard over the chaos of battle. The French called the Hotchkiss le hachoir, the chopper, for the way it cut down men. German troops used various terms, but many simply referred to them as die Hölle, the hell. The tracer rounds mixed into machine gun ammunition created a visual effect that added to the terror. Every 5th or 6th round was a tracer, its phosphorescent tip creating a bright streak through the air. At night, machine gun fire looked like solid streams of light reaching out to touch targets. During the day, the effect was less visible but no less deadly. Soldiers who saw machine gun tracers coming toward their position knew that for every tracer they saw, there were 5 or 6 regular bullets they couldn't see travelling the same path. The only defence was to get down immediately and stay down. But staying down meant the attack stalled, and a stalled attack meant failure. The German High Command understood they were losing their best men at an unsustainable rate. By early summer 1918, the stormtrooper units that had spearheaded the spring offensive were shadows of their former selves. Some battalions had been effectively destroyed, their survivors scattered as replacements among regular infantry units. The training infrastructure to create new stormtroopers had been overwhelmed by losses. Young recruits arriving at the front in mid-1918 had a fraction of the training their predecessors had received. Many had less than 100 hours of total military training before being thrown into combat. Meanwhile, American troops were arriving at a rate of nearly 250,000 per month by summer 1918. These fresh soldiers, well-fed and well-equipped, were being integrated into Allied formations, and many of them were being equipped with machine guns, including thousands of Hotchkiss weapons purchased from French manufacturers. The final German offensives in June and July 1918 were desperate affairs. The attacks went forward because Ludendorff didn't know what else to do, but there was no longer any realistic hope of breakthrough. French and American machine gunners stopped German attacks cold. At the Second Battle of the Marne in July, French forces, including American divisions attached to French corps, conducted a counter-offensive that drove the Germans back across the Marne and began the series of Allied offensives that would become known as the 100 Days Campaign. The German army never recovered. By August, the initiative had passed permanently to the Allies. The Stormtroopers, Germany's innovation in tactics, had been defeated not by superior tactics, but by superior firepower, anchored on reliable machine guns like the Hotchkiss. When the armistice came on November 11, 1918, the French army had over 47,000 Hotchkiss machine guns in service. The total number of all Hotchkiss models sold internationally exceeded 100,000 weapons. The gun had proven itself in literally every theatre where French forces fought. It had been used in the trenches of the Western Front, in the mountains of the Italian front, in the deserts of the Middle East, and in the jungles of Africa and Asia. American forces had relied heavily on the French weapon, until sufficient numbers of the Browning Model 1917 machine gun could be produced. The Hotchkiss would remain in French service for decades. During World War II, the weapon was still in inventory, used primarily in defensive positions at fixed fortifications. It saw action during the German invasion of France in 1940, and many Hotchkiss guns were captured by the Germans and used by them for coastal defense along the Atlantic Wall. After World War II, French forces continued using Hotchkiss machine guns in Indochina and Algeria, finally retiring the weapon in the 1960s, nearly 50 years after its introduction. The story of the Hotchkiss stopping the Stormtroopers is ultimately a story about reliability versus sophistication. The German Stormtroopers represented the cutting edge of tactics, training, and doctrine. They were innovative, flexible, and devastatingly effective when used correctly, but they were complex. They required elite soldiers, specialized equipment, extensive training, and perfect coordination. When conditions were right, they could achieve remarkable results. But when they faced prepared defenses anchored on reliable defensive weapons, their advantages eroded. The Hotchkiss, by contrast, was not sophisticated. It was a mechanism for converting ammunition into suppressive fire as efficiently as possible. It didn't require elite troops to operate, though training certainly helped. It didn't require perfect conditions or innovative tactics. It required three things: a good defensive position, a competent crew, and abundant ammunition. Provide those three elements, and the Hotchkiss would deny terrain to the enemy regardless of how elite or well-trained or tactically sophisticated that enemy might be. This was the fundamental lesson of World War I machine gun warfare. Offensive operations required combined arms coordination, surprise, overwhelming force, and careful planning. Even with all those elements, success was uncertain. But defensive operations anchored on machine guns could be conducted by ordinary soldiers in fortified positions with relatively straightforward tactics. And in a war where both sides had machine guns and both sides had learned to integrate them into defensive positions, the advantage lay with the defender. German stormtrooper tactics were an attempt to break this defensive advantage through superior training and tactics, and to a degree they succeeded. The initial phases of the spring offensive showed that properly trained and equipped infantry, using infiltration tactics, could break through prepared defensive lines. But breaking through was not enough. The breakthrough had to be exploited, expanded, and sustained, and that required either eliminating the defensive strongpoints that had been bypassed, or rendering them irrelevant by advancing so far and so fast that they became isolated in the rear. The stormtroopers proved capable of the initial breakthrough, but they could not sustain the advance against the type of defense in depth that the French had developed, anchored on machine gun positions that simply would not fall without direct assault. And direct assault meant casualties, heavy casualties, casualties among precisely those elite soldiers the Germans could least afford to lose. By the summer of 1918, the equation had shifted decisively. Germany had exhausted its best men and its strategic reserves in the spring offensive. The Allies, reinforced by millions of Americans, had numerical superiority, material superiority, and were employing tactics that had learned from German innovations, while retaining the defensive advantages provided by weapons like the Hotchkiss machine gun. When the Allied counteroffensives began in August 1918, German forces found themselves on the receiving end of infiltration tactics combined with tank assaults and overwhelming artillery support. They also found themselves facing the same defensive challenges they had imposed on the Allies earlier, but now they lacked the manpower, the supplies, and the national will to resist. The Hotchkiss machine gun hadn't won World War I by itself. No single weapon ever does. But it had played a critical role in the defensive systems that blunted the German spring offensive and prevented Germany from achieving the breakthrough that might have knocked France out of the war before American forces could tip the balance. In those desperate weeks of March, April and May 1918, when elite German stormtroopers armed with the latest weapons and using the most sophisticated tactics yet devised were throwing themselves at Allied lines in Germany's last chance for victory, it was often ordinary French soldiers behind Hotchkiss machine guns who stood in the way. These weren't elite troops. They were the men who had survived 4 years of war, who understood their weapons and their mission, who had learned that courage and firepower could compensate for numerical inferiority. They were the inheritors of 4 years of bitter lessons about defensive warfare, and they had a weapon that, while not glamorous or innovative, was absolutely dependable. Load it, aim it, pull the trigger, and it would fire. Keep feeding it ammunition and it would keep firing. Protect it from direct hits and it would keep firing. That reliability, that absolute mechanical dependability, meant that defensive positions could be held even when surrounded, even when cut off, even when all hope seemed lost. As long as a Hotchkiss crew had ammunition, they had a chance. And that chance was often enough. The German stormtroopers learned this the hard way. Attack after attack, position after position. They learned that tactical sophistication and elite training, while valuable, could not overcome the simple mathematics of machine gun fire. A gun that fired 450 rounds per minute created a beaten zone that no amount of courage or skill could cross without taking casualties. A defensive system built around multiple such guns in mutually supporting positions became nearly impossible to break without overwhelming force and perfect coordination. And in the chaos and confusion of battle, perfect coordination was rare. The spring offensive ultimately failed for many reasons. Logistical problems, strategic confusion, exhaustion of elite units, the arrival of American reinforcements, improved Allied coordination after Marshal Foch was appointed Supreme Commander. But at the tactical level, where individual battles were won or lost, one of the key factors was machine gun fire from weapons like the Hotchkiss, operated by crews who had learned through brutal experience how to employ them effectively. When French Hotchkiss guns stopped German stormtroopers mid-rush, they weren't just stopping individual attacks. They were stopping Germany's last best chance to win World War I, and they did it not through innovation or tactical brilliance, but through the unglamorous, brutal effectiveness of reliable weapons in the hands of determined men who refused to yield. That's perhaps the most important lesson of this story. Wars are not won by the most sophisticated tactics or the most innovative doctrines alone. They are won by the side that can sustain operations, that can replace losses, that can keep fighting when conditions are terrible and hope is dim. The German stormtroopers were magnificent soldiers employing brilliant tactics, but they were finite. Each one lost could not be easily replaced. The French machine gunners behind their Hotchkiss weapons were not elite troops. They were ordinary soldiers doing an extraordinarily difficult job. But there were more of them. They could be trained more quickly, and their weapon was reliable enough that determination and adequate ammunition could compensate for lack of elite status. In the end, that made all the difference. The thunder of Hotchkiss machine guns in the spring of 1918 announced not just the failure of individual German attacks, but the failure of Germany's last offensive and the beginning of the end of the Great War. The stormtroopers, for all their skill and courage, could not cross those final beaten zones swept by French machine gun fire, and because they could not, Germany lost the war. the mathematical reality of machine gun fire was something that German planners had understood in theory, but failed to fully appreciate in practice. A Hotchkiss gun firing at its sustained rate of 120 rounds per minute placed 2 bullets downrange every second. Each bullet travelled at approximately 350 feet per second, covering the typical engagement distance of 300 yards in less than half a second. The beaten zone, the elliptical area where bullets would strike, measured roughly 100 yards wide by 50 yards deep at that range. This meant that any soldier attempting to cross that zone faced a probability of being hit that increased exponentially with every second of exposure. German tactical manuals from 1918 acknowledged this grim mathematics. They calculated that a single machine gun covering a 200-metre frontage could theoretically engage up to 50 targets per minute. In practice, the number was lower due to terrain, visibility, and the need to shift fire between targets. But even a conservative estimate suggested that one well-positioned machine gun could halt or severely attrit a company-sized attack, roughly 150 to 200 men, before they could close to grenade-throwing range. The Stormtroopers attempted to solve this problem through combined arms integration. Their doctrine called for light infantry guns and mortars to suppress enemy machine gun positions while assault squads closed the distance. Flamethrower teams would then clear the position. In training exercises and in attacks against unprepared positions, this worked beautifully. But against French defensive positions that had been carefully prepared with the machine gun as the centerpiece, the system broke down. The problem was identification and concentration of fire. French machine gun positions were carefully camouflaged and positioned to avoid obvious placement. Bunkers were built with minimal exposure, often with only a small firing slit visible from the front. The guns themselves were set back from the aperture, making them nearly impossible to spot even when firing. Tracer rounds, while visible, did not reveal the exact position of the gun, only the general direction from which fire was coming. German infantry guns and mortars trying to suppress these positions often ended up firing at suspected locations rather than confirmed positions. And even when they scored hits near a machine gun position, the hardened emplacements provided substantial protection. A direct hit from a 70-cm shell might destroy a machine gun position, but near misses that would kill or wound men in open trenches often left well-protected gun crews intact and functional. Moreover, the French had learned to employ their machine guns in depth. The forward positions were often supported by additional guns positioned further back, covering the same ground from different angles. When German forces succeeded in suppressing or destroying a forward machine gun position and advanced, they would find themselves taking fire from positions they hadn't known existed. This defense in depth meant that even successful local attacks often culminated in failure, as fresh defensive positions engaged the attackers. Lieutenant Ernst Junger, who would later become one of Germany's most famous war authors, led stormtrooper attacks during the Spring Offensive. His memoir, Storm of Steel, contains vivid descriptions of attacking into French machine gun fire. He described one attack near Cambrai where his company, reduced to about 80 men, attempted to take a French strongpoint. They advanced under cover of their own, mortar fire, moving quickly through a communication trench. When they emerged into the open to assault the position, French machine guns opened fire from 3 directions. Junger wrote that the sound was like giant sheets of canvas being torn, a ripping noise that was both mechanical and somehow organic. Men around him were falling before they even understood they were under fire. Those who made it back to cover had achieved nothing except adding their dead and wounded to the casualty lists. What made these experiences particularly demoralizing for German troops was the asymmetry of the exchange. A machine gun crew of 3 men, protected by earth and concrete, could inflict dozens of casualties while remaining essentially invulnerable to rifle fire. German soldiers could shoot at a French machine gun position all day without effect. Only direct fire from infantry guns, mortars, or field artillery could neutralize these positions, and that required time to bring up the weapons, identify the target, and conduct the fire mission. Time that wasn't available during fast-moving stormtrooper attacks. The doctrine of bypassing strongpoints and leaving them for follow-on forces assumed that these positions could be isolated and reduced later. But French machine gun positions, positioned for mutual support, couldn't be effectively isolated. Bypassing one position meant moving into the field of fire of another. The stormtroopers found themselves forced to either halt their advance and reduce these positions methodically, which negated their mobility advantage, or press forward and accept casualties that rapidly eroded their combat effectiveness. The human cost of these tactical problems was staggering. The 18th Reserve Division, which participated in the initial assault of Operation Michael, began the offensive with approximately 12,000 men. After 10 days of combat, it had suffered over 7,000 casualties, a loss rate of nearly 60%. Similar casualty rates appeared across divisions that had been heavily engaged. The Guards Reserve Corps, containing some of Germany's finest troops, lost over 18,000 men in the first 2 weeks of fighting. These were not merely losses, they were the destruction of military capability. A division that had lost 60% of its strength wasn't simply a smaller version of its former self. It had lost its cohesion, its experienced leaders, its institutional knowledge. Replacements arriving to fill these gaps had minimal training and often came from older age groups or men who had been previously rejected for service. The quality of German infantry degraded rapidly as the spring offensive consumed the best men. By contrast, French machine gun crews required relatively less training to achieve basic competence. The Hotchkiss was simple enough that a crew could be trained to operational effectiveness in a matter of weeks. Loading the ammunition strips, clearing jams, the infrequent occurrence when they happened, changing barrels and basic fire discipline could all be taught relatively quickly. Advanced techniques like indirect fire and precise range estimation took longer to master, but even a basically trained crew could defend a position effectively. This difference in training requirements created a strategic asymmetry. Germany was spending months training elite stormtroopers who would then be consumed in days or weeks of combat. France was training adequate machine gun crews in weeks who could serve effectively for months. The replacement rates favoured the defensive. The ammunition consumption of sustained machine gun operations was itself a form of industrial warfare. A single Hotchkiss gun in a major engagement might fire several thousand rounds. Multiply that by the thousands of machine guns in action across the front, and the total ammunition expenditure reached astronomical figures. During the peak of the spring offensive fighting, French factories were producing over 200 million rounds of small arms ammunition per month. The infrastructure to support this production was vast. Copper for cartridge cases, lead for bullets, brass for the Hotchkiss ammunition strips, powder for propellant, primers, all had to be manufactured to precise specifications and delivered to the front in continuous streams. The French logistics system, refined through 4 years of war, could sustain this level of consumption. The French railway network, operating in friendly territory with intact infrastructure, could move millions of pounds of ammunition to forward supply dumps. From there, trucks and horse-drawn wagons carried it to battalion dumps, and finally human porters moved it to the actual gun positions. German logistics, by contrast, were struggling. The advance during the spring offensive moved faster than the supply system could follow. Roads in the captured territory had been systematically destroyed. Railways had been torn up. German pioneers worked desperately to restore lines of communication, but the work took time. Meanwhile, attacking units were consuming ammunition at rates that couldn't be sustained. This created a vicious cycle. German attacks would begin with adequate ammunition and achieve initial success, but as they advanced, their ammunition supply would thin out. Machine gun crews and riflemen would be rationed to a specific number of rounds per day. Artillery would be restricted to only supporting critical attacks. Meanwhile, French defenders, falling back on intact supply lines, maintained full ammunition loads. Their machine guns could fire without restriction. The Hotchkiss guns themselves became symbols of this industrial disparity. Each gun represented thousands of hours of skilled labour, precision machining, and quality control. The cooling rings had to be precisely manufactured to ensure proper heat dissipation. The gas piston had to be machined to exact tolerances to ensure reliable operation. The barrel had to be rifled with precision grooves. Yet French industry was producing these complex mechanisms by the thousands, along with millions of ammunition strips and hundreds of millions of cartridges. Germany's industrial capacity, stretched by the British blockade and the demands of a two-front war, couldn't match this output. German machine gun production focused on the MG08, a water-cooled Maxim variant that was effective but required more resources to manufacture. The MG08-15, an air-cooled light machine gun, was simpler and cheaper, but less suitable for sustained defensive fire. Neither weapon had quite the same combination of simplicity and reliability that the Hotchkiss offered. More fundamentally, Germany by 1918 was running short of everything. Copper for cartridge cases was being rationed. Steel production was falling as Swedish iron ore shipments were interdicted by the British Navy. Skilled workers had been drafted into the army and replaced by less experienced labour. Food shortages were affecting worker productivity. The entire industrial system was under strain. French industry, by contrast, was being supplemented by British production and, increasingly, by American manufacturing capacity. When French machine gun ammunition production couldn't meet demand, British factories made up the difference. When the American Expeditionary Force needed machine guns, French factories increased production and diverted weapons to their allies. The industrial capacity of three major powers was arrayed against Germany and its fading allies. The Spring Offensive represented Germany's attempt to win through tactical excellence and operational art before this industrial disparity became overwhelming. But the attempt failed in part because the tactical excellence of the Stormtroopers couldn't overcome the simple effectiveness of machine gun defense. Every day the offensive continued, Germany's advantage in timing decreased while the Allied advantage in resources increased. By June 1918, when the final German offensives were being launched, the disparity was stark. American divisions were arriving in France with full equipment sets including machine guns. Many American units trained with French weapons and tactics, including the Hotchkiss. The American 2nd Division, which would distinguish itself at Belleau Wood, included machine gun companies equipped with Hotchkiss guns. These American gunners, fresh from training, proved just as capable of stopping German attacks as their French counterparts. The simplicity and reliability of the weapon meant that national origin mattered less than determination and adequate ammunition supply. The Germans, meanwhile, were scraping together their last reserves. Boys born in 1900, just 18 years old, were being sent to the front with minimal training. Older men, previously considered too old for combat service, were being formed into replacement battalions. The average quality of German infantry was declining precipitously. Against this backdrop, the technical and tactical advantages of the Stormtroopers mattered less and less. A brilliantly executed infiltration attack conducted by exhausted troops with inadequate support and limited ammunition couldn't achieve the same results as the carefully prepared offensives of March and April, and even those offensives had been stopped, in large measure, by French machine guns. The psychological toll on German troops was immense. Soldiers who had entered the spring offensive with high hopes, believing the war could still be won, watched those hopes die in the beaten zones of French machine gun fire. Morale, which had been precarious due to food shortages and war weariness, began to crack. Units that had fought bravely for 4 years started to show signs of defeatism. Some soldiers began deliberately avoiding combat, hiding in shell holes or lagging behind their units. Others surrendered at the first opportunity when they were cut off or surrounded. The German High Command attempted to maintain morale through propaganda, emphasizing the gains made during the offensive. And the gains were real. Nearly 100,000 Allied prisoners, over 1,000 captured guns, territory recaptured that had been lost in previous years. But soldiers at the front knew the truth. They had attacked and bled and died, and the Allies were still there. The French machine guns were still firing. The British were still holding. And now Americans were arriving in ever-increasing numbers. The mathematics of attrition that had favoured the Allies since 1917 were reasserting themselves with a vengeance. Germany had gambled everything on the spring offensive and had lost. The role of the Hotchkiss machine gun in this failure was not dramatic or newsworthy. There were no individual actions by machine gun crews that changed the course of the war in a single moment. Instead, there were thousands of small actions, section-level fights where 3 men with a machine gun held a position against a platoon or company of attackers. Individually, these actions were minor tactical events, barely worth mention in official reports. Collectively, they represented the defensive system that absorbed and dissipated the force of the German offensive. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the Hotchkiss story. Strategic outcomes are often determined not by dramatic, decisive battles, but by the accumulation of many small tactical actions. The French machine gun crews who held their positions during the spring offensive weren't thinking about grand strategy or historical significance. They were thinking about keeping their gun firing, about conserving ammunition, about staying alive. But their actions, multiplied across thousands of positions along the front, created a defensive system that German tactical excellence couldn't break. The weapon that enabled these individual acts of resistance was remarkable, not for its sophistication, but for its reliability. The Hotchkiss didn't do anything particularly innovative. It simply did what a machine gun was supposed to do, convert ammunition into suppressive fire, and it did so reliably under the worst conditions imaginable. That reliability meant French officers could count on their machine guns being functional when needed. It meant defensive plans could be built around machine gun positions with confidence they would perform as expected. It meant that even when positions were isolated or cut off, the guns would keep firing as long as ammunition lasted. The contrast with more complex weapons was instructive. The Saint Etienne model 1907 machine gun, which the Hotchkiss replaced as the French standard, was a gas-operated weapon like the Hotchkiss, but it used a more complex mechanism with more parts. In muddy or dusty conditions, it was prone to malfunction. Units equipped with Saint Etienne guns reported jamming rates that were unacceptable in combat. Crews lost confidence in their weapons, knowing they might fail at critical moments. The Hotchkiss, with its 32 parts and simple design, rarely jammed. When problems did occur, they were usually related to ammunition feed issues that could be quickly resolved. Crews trusted their weapons, and that trust translated into steadiness under fire. A machine gun crew that doubted their weapon might panic when attacked, knowing they could suddenly be left defenseless if the gun failed. A crew confident in their Hotchkiss would stand and fight, knowing the weapon would keep working as long as they kept feeding it. This psychological factor, difficult to quantify but very real, contributed to the defensive effectiveness of French machine gun positions. The Germans could see this confidence in action. French machine gunners would continue firing even when heavily outnumbered, even when their position was nearly surrounded, because they knew their weapon wouldn't fail them. That kind of determined resistance was exactly what stormtrooper tactics were designed to avoid, but when every position was defended with such determination, avoidance became impossible. The spring offensive finally ended not with a dramatic climax, but with a gradual exhaustion. By mid-July, German forces were fought out. Ludendorff attempted one final attack south of Reims, which was stopped cold by French defenders who had been warned by intelligence reports and were fully prepared. When French and American forces counterattacked on July 18th at Soissons, they found German resistance surprisingly weak. The troops were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly convinced the war was lost. The tide had turned. For the remaining months of the war from August through November 1918, the Allies would conduct continuous offensive operations that steadily pushed German forces back. The roles had reversed. Now it was German machine gun crews in defensive positions trying to stop Allied attacks, and they discovered what the Allies had known for 4 years. Defense was easier than offense, and machine guns were the cornerstone of effective defense. But Germany lacked the resources to conduct the kind of defense in depth that had served the French so well. They lacked adequate reserves to counterattack when positions were lost. They lacked the industrial capacity to replace losses in weapons and ammunition. Most critically, they lacked the manpower to sustain casualties. Every German soldier lost was irreplaceable. The Allies, with American reinforcements arriving at 250,000 men per month, could replace losses and still grow stronger. The 100 Days Offensive that ended the war was characterized by combined arms operations, where tanks, artillery, infantry and air power worked together to overcome German defences. But even in these complex operations, machine guns played a crucial role. Allied forces used machine guns to suppress German positions and protect their own advances. German forces used machine guns to slow the Allied advance and extract maximum cost for every kilometre of ground lost. The Hotchkiss remained a principal weapon in French arsenals throughout this period. American forces continued using French machine guns even as American-manufactured weapons began arriving. The reliability of the design meant it remained in service even when newer weapons were available. In the final accounting of the war, it's impossible to say exactly how many German soldiers were killed or wounded by Hotchkiss machine gun fire. The records don't exist, and even if they did, the chaos of combat makes attribution difficult. A soldier might be wounded by artillery, pinned by machine gun fire and finished off by a rifle shot. Which weapon gets credit for the casualty? But we can say with certainty that French machine gun fire, much of it from Hotchkiss weapons, was a major factor in stopping the German spring offensive. We can say that the reliability of these weapons allowed French defenders to hold positions that might have fallen if equipped with less dependable arms. We can say that the industrial capacity to produce these weapons and the ammunition they consumed in vast quantities was a strategic advantage that Germany couldn't match. The legacy of the Hotchkiss extended far beyond World War I. The basic design principles, simplicity, air cooling, reliability, influenced machine gun development for decades. Later weapons would be more sophisticated, with higher rates of fire and better ergonomics. But the fundamental insight that reliability was more important than advanced features remained valid. The American Browning machine guns that would dominate the next war were direct descendants of this philosophy: simple, robust, and reliable. The Hotchkiss itself remained in service with various armies into the 1960s, a testament to the soundness of the basic design. French fortifications along the Maginot Line in the 1930s included Hotchkiss machine guns in their defensive armament. When Germany invaded France in 1940, some of the guns that opposed them were the same models that had stopped the Stormtroopers in 1918. The weapon had become obsolescent by modern standards, but it still worked, and a machine gun that works is infinitely more valuable than an advanced weapon that doesn't. For historians studying the Spring Offensive, the role of French machine guns is often understated in favour of more dramatic narratives about German tactical innovations or the arrival of American forces. But those who look carefully at the tactical details, at the after-action reports and unit histories, find the same pattern repeated again and again. German attacks would achieve initial success, then encounter prepared defensive positions anchored on machine guns, and would culminate in failure with heavy casualties. The stormtrooper tactics were innovative and effective, but they weren't sufficient to overcome the fundamental defensive advantages provided by well-employed machine guns in prepared positions. This was the hard lesson of World War I, a lesson that would have to be relearned in future conflicts. Offense was possible, but it required overwhelming advantages in firepower, mobility, and coordination. Small unit tactics and elite troops, while valuable, couldn't substitute for material superiority. And material superiority required industrial capacity, which in turn required resources, infrastructure, and time. Germany in 1918 had time to attempt one offensive before American strength became decisive. They had developed excellent tactics and trained elite troops to execute those tactics. They achieved initial surprise and success, but they couldn't sustain the offensive because they lacked the industrial depth to replace losses and maintain supply. France and Britain, despite 4 years of grinding attrition, still possessed sufficient industrial capacity to produce weapons like the Hotchkiss in quantity, and to supply them with ammunition measured in millions of rounds. That capacity, more than any single tactical innovation or battlefield victory, decided the war. The Hotchkiss machine gun was a tool of that industrial capacity. It was designed to be manufacturable in quantity, serviceable under field conditions, and reliable in operation. It succeeded brilliantly at all three objectives. In doing so, it became one of the weapons that won World War I, not through any single dramatic action, but through thousands of small tactical successes that accumulated into strategic victory. When French Hotchkiss guns stopped German stormtroopers mid-rush in the spring of 1918, they weren't just stopping individual attacks. They were demonstrating that industrial warfare had reached a point where tactical excellence alone couldn't overcome material superiority. They were proving that reliability and simplicity could be more valuable than sophistication and innovation. They were showing that wars between industrial powers would be won by the side that could produce and sustain the most effective weapons in the largest quantities. The stormtroopers represented the last gasp of the old military ideal, elite warriors using skill and courage to overcome obstacles. The Hotchkiss represented the new reality, industrial weapons wielded by adequately trained soldiers backed by the full productive capacity of modern economies. The future belonged not to the knights, but to the machine gunners, not to the elite few, but to the adequately equipped many, not to tactical brilliance, but to industrial might. That was the lesson of the Spring Offensive, written in the bodies of German stormtroopers cut down by French machine gun fire. It was a lesson Germany would remember and attempt to address in the next war with tanks and aircraft to restore mobility to the battlefield. But in 1918, the lesson was clear. When determination met reliability, when industrial capacity met tactical need, the result was weapons like the Hotchkiss machine gun holding the line against Germany's finest soldiers, And holding that line was enough to stop the offensive, enough to preserve the Allied coalition, enough to ensure that when the war finally ended, it would end in German defeat. The thunder of the Hotchkiss guns in the spring of 1918 announced not just tactical victories, but the triumph of industrial warfare itself.